When Keisha Jackson visits her son's school, she is shocked to find him isolated from his classmates for reasons that seem all too familiar. What begins as a mother's concern quickly turns into a fight against an entire system that's quietly silencing and marginalizing children like Malik. As Keisha battles the school's bureaucracy and unearths deeper injustices, she must ask herself, how far is she willing to go to protect her child, and will Malik's spirit survive the fight? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. Keisha had always dreamed of giving her son, Malik, a better life than the one she had known. Growing up in a struggling neighborhood, she knew firsthand how difficult it could be to break free from the cycles of hardship and limited opportunity. But she was determined. A single mother, working 2 jobs and taking night classes, she did everything in her power to make sure Malik's future was bright. Malik, with his wide smile and curious mind, was her beacon of hope. He excelled at school, loved reading, and always asked questions that sometimes left Keisha speechless. Today, she felt a rare moment of joy as she packed Malik's lunch for a surprise visit to his school. It had been a long week, and the extra hours at work were wearing her down. But the thought of seeing his face light up when he saw her made everything worthwhile. She'd made his favorite, grilled cheese sandwiches and apple slices, wrapped up carefully in a neat little package. Keisha couldn't wait to sit with him at lunch and hear all about his day. As she approached the school, she reflected on how proud she was of him. He had adjusted so well to the new school despite being one of the few students of color in his class. He'd told her about how he enjoyed science and how his teacher, Miss Thompson, seemed nice enough. But Keisha had noticed something off in the way Malik mentioned certain things. Sometimes it was the way he said his name wasn't called on as often, or how he was told to wait his turn, while others seemed to get more attention. Still, she brushed it aside, assuming it was just normal school dynamics. When she entered the school building, the buzz of activity reminded her of her own childhood school days. The noise, the chatter, the smell of cafeteria food mingling with the excitement of children eager for a break from their lessons. She quickly made her way to the lunchroom, her heart fluttering with anticipation. However, when she walked into the lunchroom, her joy quickly evaporated. Scanning the room, she spotted Malik sitting at a table by himself, far from the other children who sat in groups, laughing and talking animatedly. Her brow furrowed. Why was he sitting alone? As she moved closer, she saw Miss Thompson standing nearby, her arms crossed, watching Malik closely, as if she expected him to do something wrong at any moment. Keisha's steps faltered. She approached Malik slowly, her mind racing. Why was her son, who had never had behavior problems, being singled out? She could feel a tension building in her chest, but she swallowed it down, forcing a calm smile as she approached Malik's table. "Hey, baby," she said, sitting down beside him and placing the lunch in front of him. Malik looked up at her with a mix of surprise and sadness. "Hi, Mama," he said quietly. There was no joy in his voice, no excitement like she had expected. He glanced nervously at Miss Thompson, who remained nearby, eyes still trained on him. Keisha's heart sank further. Something was very wrong. She leaned in, keeping her voice soft so as not to alarm him. "Why are you sitting by yourself? Where are your friends?" Malik hesitated, his small fingers fiddling with the edge of his sandwich wrapper. "Miss Thompson said I had to sit here today," he mumbled, looking down at the table. Keisha felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She turned her head slightly toward the teacher. "Miss Thompson?" she called out, her voice calm but firm. The teacher, who had been pretending not to notice Keisha, finally stepped forward. "Yes?" Miss Thompson asked, her tone curt. "Why is Malik sitting by himself?" Keisha asked, doing her best to keep her voice steady. Miss Thompson sighed, as if she were dealing with a troublesome child rather than a concerned parent. "Malik has been a bit disruptive in class lately, so I thought it would be better if he had some time to sit alone and reflect on his behavior." Keisha blinked, stunned. Malik? Disruptive? That didn't sound like her son at all. She looked back at Malik, who was now staring down at his lunch, refusing to meet her eyes. "Disruptive how?" Keisha asked, still trying to understand. Miss Thompson pursed her lips. "Talking out of turn, not following instructions as promptly as he should. It's just a matter of maintaining classroom order, Mrs. Jackson. I'm sure you understand. Keisha felt a wave of indignation rise within her, but she held it back, refusing to make a scene in front of her son. Instead, she looked back at Malik, her heart breaking at the sight of him sitting there, isolated and confused. "Come on, baby," she said softly, pulling him and his lunch over to a nearby table where other children sat. "You can sit here with me." As they sat down, she could feel Miss Thompson's eyes on her, but Keisha didn't care. She wasn't about to let her son be treated like this. As Malik began to eat, Keisha watched him closely, her mind racing with questions. What was really going on here? Why was her son being treated differently? And how long had this been happening? Keisha knew she couldn't let this slide. She had spent her whole life fighting against the barriers that society placed on people like her. And now, seeing the same injustice being done to her child, she felt a fire ignite within her. This wasn't just about a bad day at school. This was about something deeper, something more insidious. And she wasn't going to let it go. As they finished their lunch, Keisha held Malik's hand tightly, promising herself that she would get to the bottom of this. Her son deserved better. He deserved to be treated with the same respect and care as any other child. And if that wasn't happening, Keisha was ready to fight for him. But as they walked out of the lunchroom, Keisha couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test everything she believed in. Keisha couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to her after leaving the school that day. The way Malik had been sitting alone, separated from his classmates, with Miss Thompson looming over him. It wasn't right. No matter how much she tried to reason it out, nothing about the situation made sense. Her son wasn't perfect, but he was a good boy, thoughtful, smart, and respectful. The idea of him being disruptive didn't fit. There was something else at play here, something she couldn't quite put her finger on yet, but she knew she had to get to the bottom of it. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table, she tried to coax more information out of Malik. He was unusually quiet, pushing his food around on his plate, the sparkle in his eyes dimmed. She could see the weight of whatever had happened at school resting heavily on his small shoulders. "Malik," she said softly, placing a hand on his, "can you tell me what happened today? Why did Miss Thompson make you sit by yourself?" Malik hesitated, glancing up at her with uncertain eyes. He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know, Mama. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just answering a question." Keisha frowned. "What do you mean? What question?" He sighed, as if he didn't want to revisit the day. "We were talking about famous people in history, and I said I wanted to do my project on someone who looked like me, but Miss Thompson said that wasn't the point of the assignment. She said we should focus on more important people." Keisha's heart sank as she listened. She could feel her frustration rising, but she kept her voice calm for Malik's sake. "And what happened after that?" "I tried to explain that I thought it was important too. I wasn't yelling or anything. I was just talking like the other kids, but Miss Thompson told me to be quiet. Then, when I tried to talk again later, she told me to go sit by myself." Keisha felt her chest tighten with a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just about Malik being disruptive. This was about him being silenced, about his voice being dismissed simply because he wanted to share a part of himself, a part that Miss Thompson, for whatever reason, didn't value. She leaned over, cupping Malik's face in her hands. "Baby, you didn't do anything wrong. You have every right to speak up, and what you said was important. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like your voice doesn't matter, okay?" Malik nodded, but the sadness in his eyes lingered. Keisha could see that he didn't fully believe her. He was starting to internalize the message that Miss Thompson had sent him, that his thoughts, his identity, weren't as valuable as those of the other children. As Keisha tucked Malik into bed that night, her mind raced. This wasn't just an isolated incident. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Malik had been coming home with small stories like this for weeks now. He would mention how Miss Thompson never seemed to call on him, how he was always told to wait his turn, how the other kids were allowed to laugh and joke during class, but when he tried to join in, he was told to be quiet. It had been building up, little by little, until today, when it had all come to a head. Keisha knew she couldn't let this go. She needed to talk to someone, Miss Thompson, the school principal, anyone who could give her answers. But deep down, she already knew what was happening. Malik was being singled out, not because of his behavior, but because of his identity. And if she didn't step in, it would only get worse. The next morning, Keisha arrived at the school early, determined to speak with Miss Thompson. As she waited outside the classroom, she watched the children filing in, laughing and chatting. Malik walked in quietly, his head down, blending into the background. It broke her heart to see him like that, so unlike his usual confident self. When Miss Thompson finally arrived, Keisha approached her calmly. "Miss Thompson, can I have a word with you?" The teacher looked surprised but nodded. Stepping aside into the hallway, Keisha took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to come off as confrontational, but she also wasn't about to let this slide. "I'm concerned about the way Malik is being treated in your class," she began. "Yesterday I came to visit him during lunch and I saw that he was sitting by himself. He told me it was because he was being disruptive, but I don't understand why he was singled out when it seems like the other kids were behaving similarly." Miss Thompson's expression hardened slightly. "I assure you, Mrs. Jackson, I treat all my students fairly. Malik was being disruptive, and I had to separate him from the group to maintain order. It's nothing personal." Keisha's jaw clenched. She knew that tone. It was the same tone people used when they didn't want to acknowledge the truth. She had heard it her whole life, from teachers, from employers, even from neighbors. It was the tone of someone who didn't see her, who didn't see Malik, as fully deserving of the same respect and understanding as everyone else. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Miss Thompson," Keisha said, her voice firm. "But I do think there's something more going on here. Malik feels like he's being treated differently, and from what I've seen, it seems like he's right." Miss Thompson stiffened. "Mrs. Jackson, I follow the school's disciplinary policies to the letter. If Malik feels that way, I'm sorry, but I have to maintain control of my classroom." Keisha bit her tongue, holding back the retort that was on the tip of her tongue. She didn't want to escalate the situation here. She needed to be smart about this. But the conversation left her with no doubt. Miss Thompson wasn't going to admit to any wrongdoing, and the school's system was set up to protect teachers like her from accountability. As she left the school that day, Keisha's mind was racing. She had hit a wall with Miss Thompson, but she wasn't going to give up. If the teacher wasn't willing to acknowledge the problem, then Keisha would go higher. She would talk to the principal, the school board, anyone who would listen. She couldn't let this slide. Malik deserved better, and she was going to make sure he got it. But as she walked away from the school, Keisha couldn't shake the feeling that she was up against something much bigger than just one teacher's bias. This was a system, and it wasn't going to be easy to change. Still, she had no choice but to fight, for Malik's sake and for every child who had ever been made to feel small because of who they were. Keisha sat in the waiting area of the principal's office, her hands tightly gripping the edges of her chair. The school secretary had offered her a cup of water, which sat untouched on the small table beside her. She didn't need water. She needed answers. Her thoughts swirled as she replayed the conversation with Miss Thompson in her mind. The teacher's dismissiveness, her refusal to even consider that Malik was being treated unfairly, it was infuriating. But even more troubling was the realization that this problem wasn't just about Miss Thompson. It ran deeper. Keisha's determination had only strengthened since their meeting. She wasn't going to stand by while her son suffered in silence. This school had promised to provide a nurturing, inclusive environment for all children. They had failed. And if they didn't want to admit that, Keisha was prepared to make them. The office door opened, and Principal Howard stepped out with a polite but tight-lipped smile. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a demeanor that radiated professional detachment. Keisha had only met him in passing before now, but she'd heard enough from other parents to know that he wasn't one to easily admit fault. "Mrs. Jackson, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing toward his office. "Please come in." Keisha followed him into the office, her eyes briefly scanning the rows of certificates and awards that adorned the walls. The room was pristine, organized to perfection, a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She took a seat in front of his desk, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. Principal Howard sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "I understand you've had some concerns regarding Malik's experience in the classroom," he began, his voice measured and neutral. Keisha wasted no time. "Yes, I do. I'm very concerned about the way Malik is being treated by his teacher, Miss Thompson. He's been consistently singled out, isolated from his peers, and made to feel like he's done something wrong when all he's done is try to participate like everyone else." Principal Howard nodded, as if he'd heard this kind of complaint many times before. "I see. Miss Thompson did mention there have been some disciplinary issues with Malik." Keisha cut him off, her voice sharp but controlled. "Disciplinary issues? Malik has never had problems in school before. I'm not here to talk about his behavior. I'm here to talk about why he's being treated differently from the other children." There was a brief pause, and Principal Howard's expression shifted slightly. He leaned forward, speaking in a softer tone, as if he were about to share some grand wisdom. "Mrs. Jackson, I understand your concerns, and I can assure you that we take all matters of fairness and equity very seriously here. However, I trust Miss Thompson's judgment when it comes to managing her classroom. She's one of our most experienced teachers, and she follows our school policies very closely." Keisha's jaw tightened. The familiar language of bureaucracy, phrases designed to deflect responsibility while maintaining an air of professionalism. "Policies aren't the issue here, Mr. Howard," she said firmly. "The issue is that Malik feels like he's being targeted, and I've seen it myself. I came to visit him at lunch yesterday, and he was sitting alone, away from the other kids, for something as small as speaking up in class. That's not discipline. That's isolation." Principal Howard's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. "Miss Thompson informed me that Malik was disrupting the class, and it was necessary to separate him so that the lesson could continue smoothly. I'm sure you understand that maintaining order in the classroom is essential for all students to learn effectively." Keisha leaned forward, her voice low but filled with conviction. "What I understand is that my son is being treated unfairly. I understand that when Malik tries to contribute, he's told to be quiet, while other children are given the chance to speak freely. I understand that he's being made to feel like he doesn't belong, and that's unacceptable." The principal sighed, glancing down at a folder on his desk, no doubt Malik's file. "Mrs. Jackson, we're committed to creating a supportive environment for all of our students. But I need you to trust that our teachers are doing what's best for the classroom as a whole." Keisha felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't about what was best for the classroom. This was about what was right for her child. She had come here hoping for answers, for some acknowledgement of the problem, but it was clear that Principal Howard wasn't going to budge. "I understand that you have policies to follow," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I also understand that those policies are being applied unfairly when it comes to Malik. I'm not here to make trouble, Mr. Howard. I'm here to make sure my son is treated with the same respect and care as every other student in this school." The principal's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained polite. "I can assure you, Mrs. Jackson, that we do not treat any student differently based on their background. We value diversity here at this school." Keisha's frustration boiled over into something sharper. She stood up, leaning across the desk slightly, her eyes locked on his. "It's not enough to say you value diversity, Mr. Howard. You need to show it. My son is not just a number in your system. He's a child who deserves to be heard and respected. And if this school can't do that, then I'll make sure everyone knows about it." For the first time, Principal Howard's calm demeanor wavered. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, as if calculating his next move. "Mrs. Jackson, I understand that you're upset, but I assure you we are doing everything we can to ensure that Malik has a positive experience here." Keisha straightened up, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'll be in touch with the school board," she said simply. "This conversation isn't over." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the office, her heart pounding in her chest. As the door closed behind her, Keisha felt a mix of anger and determination swirling inside her. The principal had been polite, but his words were empty. He wasn't going to do anything, and she knew it. But that didn't mean she was powerless. She had options, she had a voice, and she was going to use it. Over the next few days, Keisha began gathering every bit of information she could. She wrote down every incident Malik had mentioned, every subtle slight, every time he was silenced or singled out. She spoke with other parents, carefully asking if they had noticed similar things happening with their own children. To her surprise, several parents of color shared stories that echoed her own. Small instances of bias, subtle forms of exclusion that had gone unnoticed or unchallenged. Keisha began to see the pattern. This wasn't just about Malik. It was about a system that allowed teachers like Miss Thompson to perpetuate a quiet, insidious form of discrimination without ever being held accountable. And it wasn't just happening here. It was happening in schools all over the country. With each conversation, Keisha's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for Malik anymore. She was fighting for every child who had ever been made to feel small, who had ever been told that their voice didn't matter. And she wasn't going to stop until something changed. Late one night, after Malik had gone to bed, Keisha sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open in front of her. She had drafted a letter to the school board, outlining everything that had happened, every instance of unfair treatment, every conversation she'd had. She was meticulous, careful to include only the facts, but the letter was filled with the passion of a mother who had had enough. As she read it over one last time, Keisha felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew that she had to keep pushing. For Malik, for every child like him. With a deep breath, she hit send. The struggle for justice had only just begun. As the days passed, the tension around Malik's situation only seemed to grow. Keisha's letter to the school board had sparked some attention, but the wheels of change moved slowly. She had received a formal acknowledgement, a standard, impersonal response, thanking her for her concern and assuring her that the matter would be looked into. It was the kind of letter that promised nothing, and Keisha knew that real action was still far off. In the meantime, Malik was struggling. Keisha could see the changes in him day by day. The boy who used to bound through the door after school, excited to share what he had learned, now came home quiet and withdrawn. His shoulders slumped, and his smile had faded. The spark of curiosity in his eyes, the light that had once made him so eager to ask questions and explore the world, was dimming. Keisha's heart ached every time she looked at him. It wasn't just about the unfair treatment he was receiving at school anymore. It was about the toll that treatment was taking on his spirit, the isolation, the feeling of being singled out. It was starting to wear on him in ways Keisha couldn't fully see, but she could feel the weight of it in the air around them. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Keisha noticed Malik picking at his food, barely touching it. She watched him for a moment before speaking gently. "Malik, baby, what's going on? You've been so quiet lately." She reached across the table to place a comforting hand on his arm. "Talk to me, please." Malik glanced up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something deeper, something Keisha hadn't seen before. Was it doubt? A growing uncertainty in himself, in the world around him? He sighed heavily, finally setting his fork down. "I don't know, Mama," he mumbled. I don't feel good at school anymore. It's like no matter what I do, it's wrong. Even when I try to do everything right, Miss Thompson still acts like I'm causing trouble." Keisha's chest tightened. She had suspected this, but hearing Malik say it out loud made it all the more real. She could feel his frustration, his confusion. How do you explain to a child that the world can be unfair in ways that even adults don't always understand? "But you're not causing trouble," Keisha said softly, leaning forward. "You're smart and you're kind, and what you have to say is important. Miss Thompson is wrong for making you feel like you're not good enough. You know that, right?" Malik shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "I guess, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like I don't belong there." Keisha's heart broke a little more with each word. She fought to keep her composure, but tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She had tried so hard to shield Malik from this kind of pain, from the harsh realities of a world that could be unkind simply because of who he was. But here it was, creeping into his life sooner than she had ever expected. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to make him understand. "Malik, listen to me. You do belong. You belong anywhere you want to be. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. You are special, and you have so much to offer. Don't let them take that away from you." Malik nodded slowly, but Keisha could see that the weight of his experiences was still pressing down on him. She wanted so badly to take that weight off his shoulders, to make everything right again. But the truth was, she couldn't. No matter how much she fought, she couldn't erase the scars that were already forming inside him. As the weeks dragged on, things didn't get any easier. The school board's investigation was slow-moving, and while Keisha continued to push for answers, it felt like she was hitting roadblock after roadblock. Every meeting she attended, every call she made, was met with the same polite but unhelpful responses. The system, it seemed, was built to protect itself, not the students it was supposed to serve. Meanwhile, Malik's grades began to slip. The boy who had once loved learning, who had been so eager to read and explore, now seemed to be going through the motions. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his homework, his pencil hovering over the paper but rarely moving. One evening, Keisha found him sitting there, long after he should have finished, his math workbook open in front of him, but untouched. She sat down beside him, her heart heavy. "Do you need help with this?" she asked softly. Malik shook his head without looking up. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. Keisha frowned. "Of course it matters. You're so good at math, Malik. I know this isn't too hard for you." He sighed, still not meeting her gaze. "It's not that. It's just, what's the point? Even if I do everything right, it doesn't change anything." Keisha's heart sank. She could hear the hopelessness in his voice, the quiet resignation that had settled in his bones. It was more than just frustration. It was a deep sense of defeat, the kind that came from being made to feel like no matter how hard you try, you'll never be good enough. She wrapped her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "Malik, I know it feels like that right now, but I promise you, things will change. I'm fighting for you. And you have to keep fighting too, okay? Don't give up. You're too smart, too strong to let them win." Malik leaned into her embrace, but Keisha could tell that her words, while comforting, didn't fully reach him. The scars were already there, unseen but growing deeper with each passing day. She felt powerless, watching the light in her son dim as the school continued to fail him. Then one day, Malik came home with a new look of sadness, one that chilled Keisha to the core. He handed her a piece of paper, his eyes downcast. "I got my essay back," he mumbled. Keisha looked at the paper in her hands. Malik had spent hours working on this essay, an assignment about envisioning a better world. He had chosen to write about a world without prejudice, a place where people were treated equally, regardless of their race or background. Keisha had been so proud of him for pouring his heart into it, for daring to dream of something better. But there, scrawled in red ink at the top of the page, was a low grade. Below it, Miss Thompson's comment, "Unrealistic, focus on more achievable ideas." Keisha stared at the words, disbelief and anger flooding her system. How could anyone dismiss Malik's vision like this? How could a teacher, a person meant to nurture a child's imagination and hope, be so callous, so short-sighted? She looked at Malik, her heart aching for him. "This is a beautiful essay," she said softly. "Don't let her tell you otherwise." Malik shrugged, but Keisha could see the disappointment etched in his face. "I thought it was good," he whispered, "but she said it's not possible." Keisha shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "It is possible, Malik. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But we can make it possible. Don't stop believing in that." But as the days passed, Keisha knew that the damage had been done. Miss Thompson's words had left their mark, another scar on Malik's spirit. And no matter how much Keisha reassured him, she could see that Malik was losing hope. Hope in the world. Hope in himself. The unseen scars of this injustice were deepening, and Keisha was beginning to realize that even when the battle for justice was won, the emotional wounds might take far longer to heal. Keisha sat in the audience at the school board meeting, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was packed with parents, teachers, and community members, all gathered to discuss various issues at the school. Keisha had been attending these meetings regularly for the past few months, determined to keep the pressure on the administration. She had spoken up time and time again, raising concerns about the way Malik and other students of color were being treated. Yet for all her efforts, real change still seemed elusive, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something was finally shifting. The local news had picked up on the story, and more parents had come forward with their own accounts of bias and unfair treatment. Keisha had worked tirelessly to gather their stories, compiling them into a detailed report that she had submitted to the board. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. As the meeting began, the usual formalities passed in a blur. Keisha barely heard the opening remarks, her mind racing with anticipation. Finally, the agenda shifted to the item she had been waiting for: a discussion on the school's disciplinary practices and their disproportionate impact on students of color. Principal Howard was called up to speak, and Keisha watched as he took his place at the podium, looking composed as ever. He gave a carefully worded statement acknowledging that there had been concerns raised, but insisting that the school was committed to fairness and inclusivity. He talked about new policies that were being considered and the importance of fostering a supportive environment for all students. Keisha's frustration simmered beneath the surface. She had heard these vague promises before. Words were easy. Action was what mattered. Finally, it was her turn to speak. She stood, feeling the weight of every parent who had shared their story with her, every child who had been made to feel less than. She stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Good evening," she began, her gaze sweeping over the board members and the audience. "My name is Keisha Jackson, and I'm here to talk about something that's been happening at this school for far too long. It's not just about my son, Malik. It's about every child who has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, because of where they come from." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "I've watched my son, who used to love learning, lose that spark because he's been made to feel like he doesn't belong. I've seen him isolated, punished for speaking up, while other children are given the freedom to express themselves. And I've spoken to other parents who have experienced the same thing. This isn't just a coincidence, it's a pattern." Keisha could feel the tension in the room building as she continued. "We all want our children to succeed. We all want them to be treated with respect and dignity. But that's not happening here. And it's not enough to talk about change. We need real, concrete action. We need accountability." She glanced over at Principal Howard, who was watching her with that same composed expression, though she could see a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "I'm asking this board and this administration to do more than just make promises," Keisha said, her voice rising with conviction. "I'm asking you to take a hard look at the policies you've put in place and at the people enforcing them. Because our children deserve better. Malik deserves better." When Keisha finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, other parents stood up to share their own stories. The voices that had once been silenced were finally being heard. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that change was inevitable. The board announced that they would be launching a full investigation into the school's disciplinary practices, and that all staff would be required to undergo additional training on cultural sensitivity and inclusivity. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. Keisha felt a weight lift from her shoulders, knowing that her efforts had made a difference. In the weeks that followed, there were more changes. Miss Thompson was quietly reassigned to a different position within the school district, though the official statement referred to it as a voluntary transfer. Keisha knew it wasn't the outright dismissal she had hoped for, but it was something. Malik's new teacher, Ms. Alvarez, was a breath of fresh air. From the very first day, Malik seemed lighter, more engaged. Ms. Alvarez treated all of her students with kindness and respect, encouraging them to express themselves and share their ideas. For the first time in months, Malik came home from school with a smile on his face. "Ms. Alvarez let me lead the class discussion today," he told Keisha one afternoon. "We were talking about different cultures, and she asked me to share about ours. It was cool. Keisha felt a lump in her throat as she listened to him. The change in his mood was palpable. He was coming back to life, little by little, and Keisha couldn't have been more grateful. It wasn't just about having a better teacher. It was about being seen, about being valued. But while things were improving at school, Keisha knew that the scars left by Mr. Thompson's treatment would take longer to heal. Malik still had moments of doubt, moments where he hesitated to speak up, as if he were waiting for someone to tell him he was wrong. Keisha was patient with him, always reminding him of his worth, always encouraging him to keep going. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Malik turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think things will ever really be different, Mama? Like, will people ever stop treating each other like that?" Keisha looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. She didn't want to lie to him, didn't want to tell him that the world would suddenly become fair and just overnight. But she also didn't want him to lose hope. "I think it's going to take time, Malik," she said honestly. "But I also think that people like you are going to help make things better. Every time you stand up for yourself, every time you speak out against what's wrong, you're making the world a little bit better. And maybe one day, people will stop treating each other that way. But until then, we just have to keep fighting for what's right." Malik nodded, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "I want to help other kids like me," he said quietly. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did." Keisha smiled, tears pricking at her eyes. "You're going to change the world, baby. I know it." Years passed, and as Malik grew older, he continued to carry the lessons he had learned during those difficult school years. He became an advocate for others, speaking out against injustice and working to make sure that no child had to experience what he had. His quiet strength and determination inspired others, and Keisha watched with pride as her son became a leader in his community. The fight for justice had been long and hard, but Keisha knew that it had all been worth it. Malik had come out of it stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And in the end, karma had worked its quiet hand, not through vengeance or punishment, but through growth, resilience, and the positive change that Malik brought into the world. The scars might have been deep, but they had not broken him. Instead, they had shaped him into someone who was determined to make a difference. And in that, Keisha saw the true power of justice, not in retribution, but in the creation of a better, kinder future. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.